The fluorescent lights hummed like locusts trapped inside the walls. Hannah Clarke pushed the medicine cart down the fourth-floor corridor at 2,347 hours. She caught herself thinking in military time and forced her jaw to unclench. 2 years of civilian life and her brain still operated on a 24-hour clock. The night shift stretched ahead of her like every other night shift: vital signs, wound checks, the careful orchestration of other people's suffering while she remained perfectly, deliberately invisible. Room for 12. The patient's oxygen saturation was stable. She adjusted the IV drip with fingers that moved through the motions like a machine programmed for competence and nothing else. The precision came from muscle memory, the kind burned into muscle fibers during 16 hours under sustained fire in Kandahar when she'd held a field hospital together with her hands and will and a surgical knife because the surgical instruments had run out. But no one at Seattle General noticed the way she moved. That was the point. That was the entire purpose of this life she'd constructed in the spaces between shifts. She touched the dog tag through her scrubs. Cold metal against sternum. The chain was broken, had been broken for 2 years, and she kept meaning to repair it. Instead, she kept it exactly as it was, fractured, buried, a reminder of what she'd been before the medical discharge, before the cover, before Hannah Clarke became just another night shift nurse who folded linens with hospital corners and never spoke in morning briefings. The break room smelled like stale coffee and the particular loneliness of late night. Hannah sat on the plastic chair that squeaked when you breathed on it and folded her spare scrubs with geometric precision. Corners sharp as blade edges. The younger nurses, residents and nursing students who treated the night shift like a punishment detail, had moved on to other conversations by the time she arrived. She could hear them in the next room, voices rising with the particular cruelty of people young enough to think they were invincible. Dr. Caldwell asked about that botched intubation last week, one of them said. A resident. Maybe 26. He's brilliant though, someone else answered. Did you see how he handled that septic patient? The way he just took charge. Hannah poured black coffee into a cup that had never been white. The radio clipped to her hip crackled with an incoming admission. She didn't acknowledge it, that wasn't her job until she clocked onto the ER rotation tomorrow evening. Tonight she belonged to the fourth floor, to the careful work of people healing at the pace of drips and time. But she'd heard the name. Dr. Marcus Caldwell. Chief of Emergency Medicine for 3 years running. 15 years of political maneuvering and board connections that had accumulated like interest in a bank account until his position had calcified into something untouchable. He was the kind of man who understood that power wasn't about being the smartest doctor in the room. It was about knowing which board members owed you favors, which administrators feared your influence, which conversations happened behind closed doors where no one could verify what was actually said. Hannah had encountered men like him in the military. They looked the same in uniforms and business suits, supremely confident in the belief that hierarchy was a natural law and they occupied its apex by birthright. She finished the coffee. It tasted like medication. Everything tasted like medication at this hour. Room for 18 needed post-operative assessment. Hannah moved through the corridor with her limp barely noticeable after 2 years of physical therapy that had cost $7,000 out of pocket because the VA hospital had a 3-month wait list. Her left leg had taken shrapnel from an IED outside Lashkar. The doctors said she'd been lucky. She'd killed 17 insurgents in the 40 minutes after the explosion because her left leg was the only part of her that was damaged and pain was data and data was actionable intelligence. The limp was negligible. The way she'd learned to function while the nerve damage screamed up her thigh like electricity, that was the real skill. The patient in 418 was stable. Vital solid. Recovery trajectory normal. She noted everything in the chart with the careful handwriting of someone who'd learned that documentation was the only defense against accusations. In her previous life, she'd commanded 23 people through some of the worst hours in human history. Now she documented vital signs. The arithmetic of loss was brutal, but she'd accepted it the way she'd accepted the medical discharge, as the cost of still being alive. At 0400, just before the morning shift started, Dr. Caldwell appeared on the 4th floor. He didn't have a patient on this unit. Hannah recognized the movement immediately, the territorial sweep, the assessment, the way his eyes tracked the nurse's station like he was cataloging information for later use. He was tall enough that he had to adjust his gait slightly when he moved through doorways. His tie was silk. His shoes had been expensive once and were now simply well-maintained. Everything about him communicated that he'd never experienced a single moment of uncertainty about his right to occupy whatever space he entered. Hannah kept her hands on the chart. She didn't look up. "Nurse's station," Caldwell said. "Not a request." His voice carried the particular timbre of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Two of the younger nurses straightened immediately. Hannah continued documenting. She felt his attention shift toward her like a weight in the room. The morning briefing was held in the conference room adjacent to the nurse's station. Caldwell stood at the head of the table with a coffee in his hand that smelled like hazelnut and power. Hannah sat in the back. She always sat in the back. One of the attending physicians was presenting overnight admissions. Caldwell listened with the focused intensity of a man cataloging every word for potential use as a weapon later. Night shift was quiet, the attending said. Surgical recovery patients are tracking well. No complications. Caldwell's eyes moved across the room, landing on each nurse in sequence. When he reached Hannah, his gaze lingered. She felt the weight of his assessment, the silent calculation of a man trying to determine where the threat was coming from and why this particular nurse didn't react the way the others did. The younger nurses leaned forward slightly when he looked at them, a subtle bodily orientation that communicated deference. Hannah didn't move. She didn't meet his eyes either. She simply existed in the space between acknowledgement and invisibility, the way she'd learned to exist everywhere since the discharge. "Any concerns from night shift?" Caldwell asked. His eyes were still on Hannah. No one spoke. The silence in the conference room had a particular quality, the kind of silence that happens when people have learned that speaking carries risk. Hannah turned the page in her clipboard. The paper made a soft sound that seemed to echo in the quiet. Caldwell set his coffee on the table. The cup made a small clink against the surface. "I expect full documentation of every patient transition. Every anomaly. Every deviation from protocol. I've built a department where excellence is not optional." His gaze moved away from Hannah, but she could feel the residue of his attention, the way some people left a mark on the space they occupied just by being present in it. The briefing ended. Hannah filed out with the other night shift nurses, her limp barely perceptible as she moved down the corridor. She could hear Caldwell behind her, speaking to one of the residents about a surgical case from the previous week. His voice had a particular quality when he was teaching, precise, authoritative, the voice of a man who'd never questioned whether he deserved to be the smartest person in any given room. In the locker room, Hannah changed out of her scrubs and back into civilian clothes. Dark jeans. A grey shirt that could belong to anyone. Her jacket had a small tear in the left pocket that she'd never bothered to repair. Invisible damage. She touched the dog tag through her shirt one more time before pulling her jacket closed. The parking lot was empty except for her 2008 Honda Civic, which she'd purchased for cash because loans required background checks and background checks sometimes flagged names that had been officially discharged from the Marine Corps. The car was reliable. It didn't draw attention. It was the vehicular equivalent of her nursing career, functional, competent, completely forgettable. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and watched the sky begin its transition from black to grey. The radio in the hospital was audible even from the parking lot, a faint crackle of codes and patient updates and the particular language of people managing other people's mortality. In a few hours, she'd return for the evening shift. She'd continue documenting. She'd continue being the person who never spoke in morning briefings. She'd continue hiding the broken dog tag beneath clothes that smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness that came from spending 12 hours in recirculated hospital air. What she didn't know, as she drove home through the San Diego dawn, was that Dr. Caldwell had already begun the process of deciding that her silence was insubordination. That her refusal to perform the small gestures of deference that everyone else performed, the forward lean, the attentive eye contact, the nervous laugh at his jokes, constituted a threat to the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years constructing. She didn't know that he'd already begun making notes about her, filing away small observations that he would eventually weaponize into something far more dangerous than simple dislike. She was just a nurse who worked the night shift and folded linens with military corners and never spoke unless spoken to. But that wasn't the worst part. The morning round started like every other morning at Seattle General, fluorescent lights casting their pale wash across the 4th floor, the ventilator in room for 12 cycling its mechanical rhythm, Dr. Caldwell moving through the corridor with the gait of a man who believed the hospital existed to validate his decisions. Hannah pushed the medication cart 3 steps behind him, her scrub still damp at the collar from the overnight blood drive she'd assisted with, her movements efficient enough to be invisible. That was the goal. Invisible. Room for 18 held a homeless veteran named Marcus, 63 years old, admitted 48 hours earlier with blunt force trauma to the abdomen after what the police report called an altercation outside the transit station. His blood pressure had been tracking downward since intake. 140/90 on admission. Now it sat at 118/72. Still dropping. The kind of slow deterioration that meant internal bleeding, the kind that required observation, not discharge paperwork. Caldwell stood at the foot of Marcus's bed, reviewing the chart with the casual certainty of a man who had never been wrong. "We're discharging you today, Marcus. You're stable." The CT came back negative for major organ involvement. Hannah stepped forward. Her voice came out level, the voice of someone reading from a protocol manual. "Dr. Caldwell, the patient's blood pressure is still dropping. Protocol requires 24-hour observation for potential internal bleeding." The silence that followed had weight. The kind of weight that makes people uncomfortable. Caldwell turned to face her, not quickly, but with the precision of a chess player moving a piece he'd already decided the trajectory of. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Are you a doctor now, Nurse Clarke? Or just confused about the hierarchy?" 3 nurses at the medication station froze. Their hands stopped moving. One of them, Jennifer, new to nights, 24 years old with a hesitant face, kept her eyes on the computer screen as if the password field might suddenly become interesting. Hannah's jaw tightened. One breath. Measured. "I'm following the trauma protocol you signed off on last month. The one that requires." "I'm aware of the protocol." Caldwell's voice had taken on the texture of a tank idling in a garage, present, grinding, ready to move. "I wrote the protocol. Which means I interpret it. Which means when I say he's discharged, he's discharged." Hannah said nothing else. There was nothing left to say to a man whose certainty had calcified into something that looked like confidence but moved like cruelty. She stepped back. The medication cart creaked as she moved it forward. Caldwell turned back to Marcus and began writing discharge orders with a surgeon's careful penmanship. The next part came in the afternoon. Hannah was counting pills in the medication dispensary, morphine, Dilaudid, fentanyl patches arranged in their locked compartment by dosage, when the overhead PA system crackled to life with a sound like static breaking apart. Paging Nurse Nightingale to the 4th floor. "Nurse Nightingale, your expertise is required. 4th floor." The PA repeated the message. Laughter rippled through the corridors like a contagion, not loud enough to be obviously mocking, but calculated, the kind of laughter designed to carry a message. Nightingale. A title one of the younger nurses had given her weeks ago as a kind of joke. Hannah knew it had teeth. She'd heard it whispered in break rooms, seen it written on the whiteboard in the lounge. Nightingale, because she worked the night shift, because she was quiet, because nurses were supposed to be angels of mercy and she was exactly the opposite of an angel in Caldwell's estimation. Hannah's hands didn't stop moving. She finished counting the morphine tablets. 182. Then 183. Her jaw clenched so tight she felt the hinge of it, but her hand stayed steady. She set the tablet bottle down with the precision of someone placing a detonator, and walked to the 4th floor without changing her expression. When she arrived, there was no emergency. There was no patient crisis or crisis code. There was just Caldwell, standing near the nurse's station, watching her with the satisfaction of a man who had just made someone small feel smaller. 2 hours later, the supply closet door shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. She'd come in to restock the automated external defibrillator pads. Caldwell blocked the doorway. He was close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, not fresh coffee, but the remnant of afternoon coffee, bitter and gone stale. His voice came out low, the way men spoke when they were certain they had power. "I've documented 3 policy violations." He held up his phone, the screen dark. "Questioning my judgment in front of staff. Accessing patient files outside your assigned cases. Extended breaks without notifying the charge nurse." Hannah's hands didn't move. She didn't step back. The closet was narrow enough that Caldwell's presence filled most of it, his white coat like a banner of his authority. She could feel the dog tag beneath her scrubs, cold metal against warm skin, a weight that had been constant for 2 years. The performance review board meets in 6 weeks. Caldwell's smile was a thing with teeth. "I have friends there. Friends who value institutional order." Hannah's voice came out with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would have broken the ordinary rules of fear. "Cruelty always looks like strength to small men, Dr. Caldwell." A single tear, just one, escaped down her right cheek. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. She held his gaze the way a person holds water in their palm, with perfect stillness, with the understanding that any movement would cause it to spill. Caldwell's face darkened. He wasn't expecting tears. Tears suggested breaking. Tears suggested winning. What he saw instead was a woman whose tear had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pity. He left the closet. The next evening arrived with the smell of rain beginning somewhere over the Pacific, that particular San Diego humidity that came at dusk. Hannah was finishing her medication rounds, checking for drips and documenting fluid intake on the post-surgical recovery floor, when Caldwell's voice came through on the intercom system again. Not paging her this time. Making an announcement. "Staff meeting. 4th floor conference room. All personnel. Now." 23 people filed into the conference room. Hannah arrived last, positioning herself at the back near the door where she could see everyone else and no one had to look directly at her. Caldwell stood at the front, his hands in his coat pockets, his presence moving through the room like something with weight. "As of this evening, Nurse Clarke will be reassigned to transport and sanitation duties on the 4th floor pending completion of a comprehensive performance review. This is in accordance with departmental policy regarding scope of practice violations." He turned to Hannah. His smile was professional now, the smile of a man who had witnesses. "Your orderly badge is at the front desk, Nurse Clarke. You'll begin those duties tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Hannah felt the collective intake of breath around her. Felt the awkward shift in posture as colleagues suddenly became very interested in the carpet. Jennifer, the young nurse, was looking at her hands. One of the senior nurses, Patricia, who'd worked nights for 14 years, stared straight ahead with the expression of someone watching something she knew she should help with but couldn't. Hannah accepted the orderly badge when she collected it. Yellow, with her name printed in block letters, N. Clarke. No title. No credentials. Just a name and the color of someone who moved things and cleaned spaces and wasn't quite part of the hospital's real hierarchy anymore. She watched Caldwell walk out of the building. Watched his car pull away from the parking lot where the evening rain had begun to fall harder, turning the asphalt into something that gleamed like oil. Her hand found the dog tag beneath her scrubs, that single piece of metal that carried the weight of 2 decades, of 1,000 decisions made under fire, of names that she'd kept alive in her memory while she worked 12-hour shifts changing bedpans and not being who she actually was. That night, sitting in her car in the parking lot of Seattle General, Hannah replayed the day like a recording she could pause and rewind. She thought about the battalion commander in Kandahar, the real Caldwell, the one with character etched into his face like scar tissue. That Caldwell had asked her for her opinion. That Caldwell had trusted junior officers to see things he couldn't. This Caldwell's are only threats to the authority he'd spent 15 years constructing, brick by brick, through phone calls and board connections and the careful cultivation of people who owed him favors. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance that hadn't started yet. Hannah sat in the darkness of her car and rehearsed the conversation she'd have with her landlord about next month's rent. She rehearsed the one she'd have with her physical therapist about why she'd missed her last 2 appointments. She rehearsed the way her sister would sound when Hannah called to say no, she couldn't come home for the weekend because she had orderly shifts and a performance review and a life that was slowly becoming something she no longer recognized. The medical discharge from the Marine Corps had been supposed to be a beginning. A chance to heal without the weight of command pressing down on her spine like a physical thing. A chance to be ordinary. To be small. To be safe. But that wasn't how this was ending up. The reassignments came Thursday morning, posted on the break room bulletin board without announcement. Hannah saw them during her 11 p.m. shift check-in. Nurse Patterson transferred to pediatrics. Nurse Reeve shifted to orthopedics. Nurse Kim moved to cardiac care, effective immediately. 3 names. 3 nurses who'd worked night shift with her for 18 months. 3 people who'd learned to read her silence as competence and matched it with their own quiet respect. Gone. The message was written in institutional language, but Hannah understood the grammar of retaliation. Caldwell had orchestrated this with the precision of someone who'd spent 15 years mastering hospital politics. He didn't need to explain anything. The board would see routine staffing optimization. What Hannah saw was isolation with a signature. She clipped her badge to her scrubs and moved to the 4th floor. The skeleton crew waited, 2 nurses she didn't know well, both newer, both still learning which patients needed space and which needed conversation. She'd manage. She'd always managed. But the weight of it settled into her shoulders like a rucksack loaded with stones. By Friday, the access restrictions appeared in the electronic system. A flag on her employee profile, limited authorization pending protocol review. She couldn't access the intensive care unit without supervisor approval. She couldn't pull up critical patient charts without documented justification. She couldn't assign herself to trauma cases, even during her designated shift hours. The restrictions were technically minor, administrative red tape, nothing that would explicitly violate any written rule. But they were surgical. They were designed to make her invisible, to push her to the margins where she couldn't demonstrate competence, couldn't prove her value, couldn't help anyone who mattered. Hannah logged into the system and stared at the flag for 3 minutes. Her jaw tightened. Just muscle tension. Not anger. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she'd learned years ago to convert it into fuel. She moved to the med-surg floor and spent the next 12 hours with stable patients, routine vitals, straightforward care. Work that didn't require the ICU access they'd taken from her. Work that would look perfectly reasonable on paper when Caldwell presented his case. That's when the real masterpiece revealed itself. Saturday morning, before dawn, Caldwell made his phone calls. Hannah didn't witness them, but she saw the aftermath. The hospital administrator called her into his office at 6:19 a.m., still carrying the exhausted look of someone who'd been woken by a text message. He held a folder with a red tab. His voice was apologetic, but his spine was rigid with institutional pressure. Ms. Clarke, Dr. Caldwell has formally requested an expedited review of your nursing license with the state board. The hearing has been moved forward by 3 months. You'll receive the notice in your employee mailbox within 2 hours. Hannah sat in the chair across from him. The office smelled like burnt coffee and the plastic coating on new furniture. She said nothing. The complaint focuses on scope of practice violations. 15 documented instances over the past 18 months. Now, some of these seem contextual, but the board takes scope violations seriously. Very seriously. They can result in license suspension or revocation. The folder sat on the desk between them like a bomb with a timer running. Hannah's eyes tracked to it but didn't touch it. Her hands remained flat on her thighs, steady as surgical steel. The hearing is Thursday. You'll have time to prepare a response. I'd recommend legal representation. She nodded once. The administrator shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with her silence. Most people fill that kind of void with excuses or panic. Hannah let it stretch empty. I'll send you the board notice when it arrives, he continued. We'll need to discuss your status here at Seattle General pending the outcome. Dr. Caldwell has also recommended a temporary restriction on certain duties until the hearing concludes. Hannah stood. Thank you. She walked back to the break room and found the mailbox notification exactly 90 minutes later. 15 pages of clinical documentation. Scope Violation 1, extended break on March 14. Hannah was covering for a nurse experiencing a panic attack, holding the floor alone rather than calling overhead for help, which technically exceeded her assigned duties. Scope Violation 2, accessed patient file on May 7 without documented clinical justification. She'd caught a medication error in a previous nurse's documentation and corrected it before it reached the patient. Scope Violation 3, questioned attending physician's discharge decision on June 21, the homeless veteran who'd arrived with cellulitis that was masking early sepsis, and she'd called it correctly. Each violation was technically accurate. Each one was stripped of context. Each one looked damning on paper. She sat in the hospital library that evening with her medical discharge papers spread across the table. 12 years of service. Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds from an IED blast in Kandahar. Silver Star for maintaining a field hospital for 16 hours while insurgent fire hammered the perimeter, treating 43 casualties with minimal supplies and a single combat knife threaded into sutures when the needle stock ran out. She pulled the dog tag from beneath her scrubs, the broken chain gleaming under fluorescent light, the metal tarnished from sweat and time. The tag that had survived Kandahar and should have stayed buried in San Diego. A janitor passed by with a floor buffer. He stopped. You military? His voice was gentle, no judgment, just recognition. Was, Hannah said. Once. He nodded and moved on. That was all. No follow-up, no questions. The kind of conversation that only happens between people who understand that some stories don't need words. Wednesday afternoon came with its own flavor of humiliation. Hannah was working the med-surg floor when Caldwell found her outside room for 12, charting vitals. He was in his white coat, perfectly creased, with a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light like it was trying to signal the entire hospital that he was someone worth watching. His voice was soft, this was the genius of it, the restraint. He was acting merciful in front of the other staff. Nurse Clarke, I wanted to give you a heads up before the board hearing. I've been through the preliminary review this morning, and I'm quite confident they'll find the scope violations well documented. The administrator is prepared to recommend termination, pending the board's formal decision. I don't think Thursday is going to be a positive outcome for you. He paused. Let that sink in. But I'm sure you'll land on your feet. Maybe try a clinic setting where the demands are less complex. He smiled. It wasn't cruel, that was what made it worse. It was sympathetic. Paternal. The smile of someone who'd already written the ending. Hannah set down her pen. She looked at him directly for the first time in weeks, and Caldwell's expression flickered. Just for a moment, but it was there. A micro-expression of someone not expecting her to hold his gaze. History, she said quietly, remembers cowards by the brave people they tried to destroy. She picked up her tablet and walked past him. The cafeteria around them had gone quiet enough that the ventilation system became audible, a mechanical wheeze like the hospital's own breath-catching. Nurses turned away. An orderly suddenly became very interested in a supply cart. Caldwell stood in the middle of the floor, and for the first time, Hannah saw something other than triumph in his posture. Doubt. A crack in the architecture he'd spent 15 years building. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then his jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and she knew his mind was already moving to damage control. The remark would spread. People would wonder. He would have to move faster, push harder, make sure she was gone before she could become something other than a dismissed nurse with an attitude problem. Thursday night, Hannah sat in her car in the hospital parking lot. Her final shift had ended at 11 p.m. The scrub she'd worn for 18 months sat folded in a plastic laundry bag on the passenger seat, still warm from her body, smelling like antiseptic and hand sanitizer and the particular staleness of a hospital that never quite gets fresh air. She'd turned in her badge. She'd cleaned out her locker. The hearing had concluded 3 hours earlier in a conference room where 5 board members reviewed Caldwell's documentation and recommended license suspension pending further investigation. The administrator had walked her to the door personally. Sympathetic. Apologetic. Institutional. She'd neither confirmed nor denied anything. The law allowed her silence. Her training demanded it. Now she sat in the dark parking lot of Seattle General and stared at the numbers in her checking account on her phone screen. Rent was due in 9 days. Her landlord was sympathetic but practical. She'd need to explain that the job had ended, that she'd need more time, that something was coming that would change everything, but she couldn't explain what. The landlord would nod and set a deadline, and she would meet it because that's what she did. She met deadlines, she completed missions, she survived. She pulled out her discharge papers from the glove compartment. Medical discharge. Permanent disability retirement. Service-connected injury. All official language for the fact that a field hospital in Kandahar had ended when shrapnel had torn through her abdomen and stopped her from doing the only thing she'd ever been trained for. Combat medicine. Leadership. The ability to command under fire and have people follow because they trusted her completely. She'd thought nursing would be the bridge. The way to help without carrying a rifle. The way to prove that what she'd learned in war could translate into something constructive, something that saved lives instead of ended them. She'd been invisible. She'd been quiet. She'd done everything right. And it hadn't mattered. The scrubs in the plastic bag crinkled as she reached over and lifted them. She could smell the hospital still embedded in the fabric. 18 months of her life, condensed into the scent of industrial detergent and the particular staleness of institutional air. She set them back down gently, like they might break. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No message. Just a calendar invite for Friday, 0600 hours, labeled urgent follow-up. Hannah stared at it. Military time. 0600 hours. No civilian hospital used military time for calendar invites. She didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge it. She closed the text and started the car and drove out of the parking lot of Seattle General, where her career had just ended and where, without knowing it yet, everything was about to change. 3 nights later, the ER doors burst open at 2,247 hours and the night collapsed into controlled chaos. A Marine, Lance Corporal Jake Morrison, 23, medevaced from a training accident, rolled through on a trauma stretcher, his left lung failing, his breathing shallow as a dying animal's. His face was grey. His oxygen sat had been 78% 5 minutes ago, and no one here knew it was dropping. Hannah was pulling a double shift in recovery, restocking full lines and running labs, when the trauma alert cut through the hospital's fluorescent hum. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3. Her hands froze on a saline bag. She didn't move. She had no access to critical patients anymore. Caldwell had made sure of that in his reassignment orders. She was supposed to ignore the alarm, finish her cart, clock out at 0700 and drive home to an apartment she could no longer afford. But then she heard the ventilator wheeze and something in her body recognized it, not the sound, but the silence underneath it. A lung that wasn't expanding. She moved toward the trauma bay despite herself, pushing through the swinging doors that should have been closed to her. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the stretcher, barking orders that made no sense. Start antibiotics. Get a central line. Chest tube insertion, standard anterolateral approach. Hannah's hand started shaking, not from fear but from recognition. Those were civilian protocols, textbook responses for blunt trauma. The Marine's pattern was different. The steering column crush, the abdominal bruising, the way his ribs had fractured in a line, that was convoy collision physics. IED blast pattern mimicry. a blast pattern she had seen 43 times under canvas in the dark. Morrison gasped, drowning in air his lung couldn't process. The monitor screamed its high-pitched warning, oxygen saturation dropping. 72%. 68. The on-call surgeon was 12 minutes out, stuck in northbound traffic on Route 163. Caldwell's voice cracked. "Where's our surgeon?" No one answered. Morrison's lips were turning grey. Caldwell froze, not a pause, a full mechanical shutdown. His competence evaporated the moment genuine crisis touched him, the moment his protocols stopped matching reality. Hannah didn't think. Her body moved like muscle memory taking over, like hands that had held this exact moment in formation 100 times before. She pushed through the trauma bay crowd, her voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of parade ground authority. "Step aside. Now." Not a request. A command. The nurses moved without hesitation, they recognized something in her voice that Caldwell had never possessed. Her hands were already gloved, already reaching for the needle decompression kit. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers moving with zero hesitation. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid in with practiced efficiency. The hiss of released pressure sounded like salvation. The hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung finding its way back to freedom. Morrison gasped, color flooding back to gray lips like a man surfacing from drowning. His chest expanded. The entire trauma bay went dead silent. You could hear the helicopter rotors in the distance, idling on the trauma pad. Morrison's eyes focused on Hannah's face, widening with impossible recognition. Major Clarke. Then he lost consciousness. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Caldwell's face drained white, then flooded red, not the flush of exertion but the crimson flood of a man watching his narrative collapse. You just practiced medicine without authorization. That is not nursing. That is, Hannah cut him off, her voice dropping an octave, that's a field thoracotomy adaptation. I learned it in Kandahar under mortar fire. The words hung in the antiseptic air like shrapnel suspended mid-explosion. She stripped off the bloody gloves with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and placed them in the red medical waste container. The surgeon arrived 6 minutes later, unnecessary, her procedure already complete. Morrison's oxygen saturation held steady at 92%. The trauma was managed. The crisis was over. The damage to Hannah's cover was irreparable. By 05:30 hours, she was sitting in the CEO's office on a plastic chair, papers sliding across a mahogany desk toward her. Termination effective immediately. Pending investigation for gross violation of scope of practice. Practicing medicine without licensure. Endangering patient welfare through unauthorized intervention. The language was precise, technically accurate, contextually stripped of every detail that mattered. Caldwell personally escorted her to her locker, watching her change out of her scrubs for the last time, watching the single dog tag swing free as she bent to gather her belongings. She folded her scrubs with hospital corners, the way she had been trained 17 years ago by a gunnery sergeant with a drill sergeant's voice, and placed them in a plastic laundry bag. The fabric was still warm from her final shift. Caldwell said nothing. He didn't ask about the dog tag. He didn't need to. He had already made 4 phone calls from his office between 02:45 and 04:30 hours. Calls to board members. Calls to the licensing authority. Calls to construct an airtight case for permanent termination based on evidence that was true but incomplete, accurate but weaponized. He had reassigned every night shift nurse who had shown her any kind of respect. He had documented every procedural adaptation she had made to save time, every shortcut that was standard practice in the ER but technically outside protocol. He had built his case with the precision of a military operation, which meant he had done it competently, methodically, and with absolute certainty he would win. Hannah returned her scrubs to the hospital laundry herself, walking through the lobby past nurses who pretended not to see her. The fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal hum overhead. In her car, she sat with her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, the leather cold against her skin. Through the windshield, San Diego was waking up. Traffic on Harbour Drive was already building. She rehearsed explanations in her mind, for her landlord, for her sister who would call asking if she was still working nights, for the Veterans Crisis Counselor she was supposed to meet with on Friday. She missed that appointment without calling. She drove home in silence, and the silence was so thick you could operate in it. The dog tag hung visible at her neck now. She had stopped hiding it. There was nothing left to hide from anymore. The rain started around 06 for 5 hours, hammering the parking lot like applause, like judgment, like 43 different ways of saying she had sacrificed everything and it still wasn't enough. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like mold and broken promises. The rent was due on the 1st. It was the 28th. She had saved $18,000 over 2 years, living like a ghost, accepting every extra shift, refusing every social invitation. $18,000 would cover the next 8 months if she stopped eating. If she found work. If anyone would hire her with a termination for practicing beyond scope. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had done exactly what she promised herself she wouldn't do. She had used her training. She had revealed what she was hiding. She had let the past catch up with her in a moment of weakness, because saving a life was weakness, because answering to the sound of someone dying was weakness, because she couldn't watch a Marine suffocate when she possessed the knowledge to save him. The dog tag was cold against her chest. It read D.M. Morrison. Staff Sergeant David Morrison, her field hospital supply officer in Kandahar. The man whose lung had been perforated by shrapnel in 2019. The man she had saved with a knife and improvised surgical technique because the equipment had run out and the generator was failing and she was the only one left standing. She had never spoken to him again after the medical discharge. She had worked hard to never think about him at all. The Marine Lance Corporal who whispered her rank in the trauma bay was his son. The boardroom was cold. Glass walls. Mahogany table. 8 board members sitting in leather chairs that cost more than Hannah made in 3 months. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood at the head of the conference table with a folder thick as a brick, his power suit pressed into knife-sharp creases, his jaw set with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle he'd chosen to fight. He had spent 48 hours building this. 3 phone calls to board members before dawn. A 17-page document detailing Hannah's scope violations with timestamps and witness statements. A narrative about a traumatized veteran who couldn't separate her military experience from civilian medical protocols. He was ready to dismantle her completely, systematically, without raising his voice once. That was his signature. Competence. Precision. Institutional power applied like a surgical scalpel. The board chairman glanced at his watch. Dr. Caldwell, you had some concerns regarding Nurse Clarke's. The doors burst open. Not quietly. Not with a knock. With the kind of controlled force that makes everyone's spine straighten involuntarily. 2 Marines in dress uniform stood in the frame, their dress blue so crisp they looked folded from fresh linen. Behind them, a lieutenant colonel with a chest full of ribbons and eyes that had seen things most people in this room couldn't comprehend. His presence made the air pressure change. He didn't walk into the room. He claimed it. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, USMC, he said. We're here for Major Hannah Clarke. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then chaos. The board chairman stood. Someone asked who authorized this. Caldwell's face went pale, not dramatic, not theatrical. Clinical pale. The color of someone watching a chess move they didn't see coming. Webb didn't wait for permission to speak. He placed a shadow box on the mahogany table. Marine Corps standard issue. Polished wood. Glass front. Inside, caught in the afternoon light from the boardroom windows, were 3 medals arranged on midnight blue felt. A purple heart. A silver star. A second purple heart. Major Hannah Clarke served 16 years in the United States Marine Corps, Webb said. His voice sounded like it was coming through a radio, that parade ground clarity that makes you listen whether you want to or not. She commanded a forward combat hospital in Kandahar province, Helm and region, for for the better part of 2 years. During Operation Enduring Freedom, she held a position under sustained enemy fire for 16 continuous hours with failing generators, no surgical support, and Taliban forces estimated at 300 meters from the perimeter. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife on a Marine who was bleeding out from a pulmonary injury. She saved his life. She saved 43 lives that day. 43. Webb turned to face Caldwell directly. You attempted to silence her for being more competent than you. That's not a policy violation. That's retaliation. Behind Webb, a younger Marine moved forward on crutches. His leg was still wrapped, still healing, but his eyes were sharp as a blade. He was Jake Morrison, the Marine Hannah had saved in the trauma bay. The son of the veteran Caldwell had tried to discharge. Jake was holding the shadow box, and tears were running down his face in perfect silence. My father told me about Major Clarke when I was 9 years old, Jake said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his shoulders. He said she saved more than his life. He said she showed him what courage looked like when you think you're out of courage. Then she came back as a nurse because she needed to keep doing that work. And Dr. Caldwell fired her for it. The board chairman looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at the shadow box. Then he did something that would define the next 12 hours of his existence. He stood up. He walked toward the door. And he said, "This is a setup." Webb watched him leave with the kind of expression that suggested he'd been anticipating that exact move for several hours. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. "Gentlemen, ladies," Webb said to the board. "Dr. Caldwell is about to do something very stupid. I'd recommend having counsel present." Caldwell's stupid thing happened at 12:17 p.m. when he called a local news station and volunteered for an interview about Seattle General's funding campaign. He needed to rehabilitate his image immediately. He needed to control the narrative before it controlled him. Live television. Sympathetic reporter. A chance to explain that he wasn't a bully. He was a concerned physician protecting patients from a traumatized veteran with unresolved PTSD. He was eloquent. That was the problem. He had a gift for making terrible things sound reasonable. "The issue isn't whether Nurse Clarke has medical training," he said, his voice carrying that careful blend of concern and authority. "The issue is judgment. Combat medicine and civilian medicine operate under completely different protocols. What might be appropriate in a war zone is dangerous in a hospital environment where we have resources, specialists, oversight." I wasn't firing her. I was protecting my patients. The anchor nodded along. The camera lingered on his composed face. He'd done this 1,000 times. He knew how to sit with authority. How to make doubt sound like wisdom. Then the station's director spoke into the anchor's earpiece. The anchor's expression changed. She said, "We have a caller." Split screen. On the other side, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, calling in via satellite phone, his uniform barely visible in the frame but his voice hitting the airwaves like a tactical strike. "I'm watching Dr. Caldwell," Webb said, "describe Major Hannah Clarke as a traumatized veteran incapable of judgment. I need to correct that for your viewers. Major Clarke earned her Silver Star not for one decision, but for 16 hours of consecutive decisions, all of them right, all of them made under fire. During a Taliban siege of forward operating base Shank in Kandahar's Sanjan Valley, the main generator failed at 2,100 hours. We lost primary lighting and power to half the surgical equipment. The surgical team evacuated. The commanding officer ordered a retreat. Major Clarke stayed. The camera kept cutting to Caldwell's face. She stabilized 12 Marines with penetrating wounds using field protocols designed in 1943 because that's all she had. When a patient's lung collapsed, a tension pneumothorax, she performed an emergency decompression with a needle, then a thoracotomy using a surgical knife and her training and nothing else. The patient survived. 42 others survived because she made the decision that her competence mattered more than fear. That's not trauma. That's leadership. Webb paused. The pause was intentional. Calculated. Dr. Caldwell is describing those skills as a liability. In Kandahar, I watched those skills save my son's life. The surgeon who wrote Major Clarke's Silver Star citation said her composure under fire was extraordinary. Dr. Caldwell's calling that PTSD. I'm calling that a man threatened by a woman who's actually competent. The split screen showed the video view counter climbing in real time. 47,000, 58,000. 103,000. Caldwell tried to speak, but his mouth just opened silently, like a fish removed from water. I should mention, Webb continued, that I'm currently calling from the office of the Commandant of the Marine Corps. We're watching this, Dr. Caldwell. America's watching. 6 million people are watching right now. The anchor leaned forward. Dr. Caldwell, how do you respond to Lieutenant Colonel Webb's account? Caldwell's hands trembled. That's when you knew it was finished. That's when the institutional power started cracking. He stammered something about protocol. Something about unauthorized procedures. The anchor asked why he'd restricted Hannah's access to critical patients if her skills were compromised. Caldwell had no answer. The anchor asked about the staff reassignments. The pre-dawn board calls. The performance review completed in 3 weeks when standard reviews took 8. By the time the broadcast ended, Webb had made one final statement that would echo through San Diego for 6 months: Hannah Clarke is a hero. Dr. Caldwell is a small man threatened by her competence. The medical board will decide who should keep their license. The view counter hit for million before the station cut to commercial. By Sunday morning, the state medical board opened an investigation into Caldwell's documentation practices. The 3 policy violations he'd cited for Hannah all had timestamp irregularities suggesting post-dated fabrication. A nurse he'd reassigned in retaliation came forward. Then another. Then 3 more. The veteran Hannah had tried to protect filed a formal complaint about his discharge decision. By Monday, Seattle General's CEO suspended Caldwell pending investigation. His lawyer reviewed the evidence and used a phrase that meant everything was finished: catastrophic exposure. Then came the waiting. The slow, methodical destruction of credibility that takes months to complete but feels inevitable the moment it starts. 6 months later, Hannah walked through the glass doors of Seattle General wearing a white coat that didn't have a single wrinkle. Her limp was barely noticeable now. The dog tag hung openly around her neck on a repaired chain, Morrison's name visible in the afternoon light. On her office door, the nameplate read, Dr. Hannah Clarke, Major USMC, RET, Director of Trauma Services. She'd earned her doctorate through a Marine Corps fellowship program while consulting on combat medicine protocols. The Veterans Trauma Center treated 200 veterans monthly, integrating military medicine with civilian care. Staff Sergeant Morrison worked there as peer support coordinator. His son Jake was in nursing school, his dreams rebuilt from the foundation of a woman who'd refused to stay small. 17 miles away, in a strip mall between a tax preparation office and a vape shop, Marcus Caldwell sat at a folding table selling supplemental insurance policies. His medical license was revoked. The state board had found 15 other cases where he'd systematically destroyed careers of staff who questioned him. His laminated name tag was deliberately misspelled: Mark Caldwell, insurance specialist, a final institutional insult that required no explanation. He watched people avoid eye contact. Hannah's office wall held the shadow box beside her diploma, the silver star catching afternoon light every time sunlight shifted across the room. She was training 3 former combat medics transitioning to nursing, teaching them that the skills that saved lives in Kandahar saved lives in San Diego. During a staff meeting, a young resident questioned one of her trauma protocols, and Hannah smiled. Actually smiled. Good catch. Let's walk through your reasoning. The resident relaxed completely. That was the difference. That was what competence looked like without cruelty attached. She spent 40 minutes that evening with a Marine veteran struggling with chronic pain and PTSD, a patient Caldwell would have discharged with a referral form and no follow-up. Hannah adjusted his treatment plan, connected him with resources, listened to his entire story without checking her watch. As he left, He thanked her for seeing him as human, not just a chart, and Hannah touched the dog tag, Morrison's name still engraved, remembering Kandahar, the weight of command, the cost of survival. Closing her laptop, she looked at the silver star and remembered Webb's words from the broadcast, words she now believed: sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. She turned off her office light and headed home, no longer hiding, no longer small, finally whole. The dog tag caught the hallway light one last time before she disappeared into the evening. If you've watched this far, you know that real strength isn't about titles or positions. It's about showing up for people when the world isn't watching. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes rebuilding their lives in places you'd never expect. Like this video if you believe competence matters more than credentials. Comment below, what would you have done in Hannah's position? And check out veteranstrauma.org for resources supporting veterans transitioning to civilian healthcare careers. There are people out there right now with your same story, waiting for someone to believe in them the way Hannah did.